I was thinking about what to make for dinner when it happened. Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago. Rush hour traffic crawling along Michigan Avenue. I just left my job at the bookstore and was crossing at the light like I'd done 1,000 times before. The walk signal was on, cars had stopped, everything looked normal. Then the world exploded. A silver SUV came barreling through the red light at what must have been 40 miles per hour. I remember seeing it in my peripheral vision, this massive blur of metal heading straight for me. There wasn't even time to jump out of the way. The impact sent me flying like a rag doll, my body hitting the asphalt hard enough to bounce. Everything went quiet for a moment. Then the chaos started. People screaming, car doors slamming, footsteps running toward me. I tried to sit up, but nothing worked right. My left leg was twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. Blood was pooling under my head, warm and sticky against the cold pavement. Someone was talking to me, telling me not to move, that help was coming. The sirens seemed to take forever. I kept drifting in and out, catching fragments of conversation around me. The driver had gotten out of his car, pacing back and forth, talking rapidly on his phone. A woman in a business suit was kneeling beside me, pressing something against the cut on my forehead. Her hands were shaking. When the paramedics arrived, they worked with the kind of focused urgency you only see in movies. IV lines, oxygen mask, questions I couldn't answer through the fog in my brain. They loaded me onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, where the real nightmare began. Every bump in the road sent lightning through my body. One of the EMTs kept checking my pulse, his face getting more concerned each time. At Northwestern Memorial, everything became a blur of bright lights and medical terminology I didn't understand. Broken ribs, shattered pelvis, internal bleeding, possible brain trauma. They wheeled me from room to room, each test revealing more damage. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, using words like critical and touch and go. I must have given them my emergency contact information at some point, though I don't remember doing it. My grandfather, Robert, had been my guardian since my parents died in a car crash when I was 15. We'd never been close, not really. He was my dad's father, a stern man who'd taken me in out of duty rather than love. Our house in Lincoln Park had always felt more like a boarding arrangement than a home. But he was family. He was all I had left. So when the social worker came to update me on my condition, I assumed she'd also tell me when he was coming to visit. The pain medication made everything fuzzy, but I remember asking about him specifically. The look on her face should have warned me. She sat down slowly, the way people do when they're about to deliver bad news. The police had called him, she explained. Told him about the accident, about my condition, asked if he wanted to come to the hospital. His response was colder than the Chicago wind in January. I'm traveling for business. It'd be good if that useless girl finally disappeared. Then he'd hung up on the officer. The social worker kept talking, something about other options and support services, but I'd stopped listening. Those words kept echoing in my head, drowning out everything else. Useless girl. Finally disappeared. This was my grandfather, the man who was supposed to care about me, talking about my potential death like it would be a convenience. Something broke inside me that day, and it wasn't just bones. It was the last thread connecting me to the idea that I mattered to someone, that I belonged somewhere. As I lay there surrounded by machines keeping me alive, I realized I was completely, utterly alone. The next few weeks passed in a haze of morphine and sleepless nights. My room on the 7th floor became my entire world, with its beige walls and the constant hum of machines monitoring every heartbeat. The nurses were kind enough, especially Marie, a woman in her 50s who worked the night shift and always brought extra pudding cups from the cafeteria. Physical therapy started 2 weeks after the surgery to repair my pelvis. The first time they made me sit up, I threw up from the pain. The second time wasn't much better. Everything hurt in ways I didn't know were possible. My ribs screamed when I breathed too deeply. My leg felt like it was on fire whenever they moved it even slightly. But somewhere in those dark hours, something shifted. Maybe it was hearing my grandfather's words replaying over and over. Or maybe it was the way the physical therapist, Kevin, never gave up on me even when I wanted to quit. Either way, I started fighting back harder than the pain was fighting me. Kevin was this young guy from Milwaukee, probably not much older than me, with an endless supply of terrible jokes and an annoying habit of pushing me just past what I thought I could handle. The first time I managed to stand for more than 30 seconds, He actually cheered. It embarrassed me, but it also felt good to have someone celebrate even the smallest victories. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain, though. It was the silence. No visitors, no phone calls, no flowers or get-well cards. Other patients had family members coming and going all day, bringing homemade cookies and gossip from home. My bedside table stayed empty, except for the hospital water pitcher and a small stack of books I'd managed to order online. I started writing in a journal Marie had given me, just to have something to do with my hands when the pain kept me awake. At first I wrote about practical things like what I'd eaten for breakfast or which physical therapy exercises I'd managed to complete. But gradually, the entries became more honest. I wrote about feeling invisible, about wondering if my grandfather had already cleaned out my room and donated my things to Goodwill. The breakthrough came almost a month after the accident. I was working with Kevin on walking between parallel bars, taking those shuffling half steps that felt like climbing Mount Everest. My legs were shaking, sweat dripping down my back, but I made it from one end to the other without stopping. Kevin was grinning like an idiot, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was my grandfather's voice. Useless girl. Well, this useless girl had just walked 20 feet on legs that doctors said might never work right again. This useless girl was healing herself back together, piece by piece, without any help from the family that was supposed to love her. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't going back to the house in Lincoln Park. I wasn't going to call and beg for forgiveness or try to prove I was worth caring about. If he wanted me to disappear, then that's exactly what I'd do. But I'd disappear on my own terms, into a life I built myself. The hospital social worker, Janet, helped me apply for disability assistance and temporary housing through a program for trauma survivors. The paperwork was overwhelming, but Janet walked me through every form with the patience of a saint. She also connected me with a therapist who specialized in family trauma, though I wasn't ready to talk about that part yet. When they finally discharged me 6 weeks after the accident, I left through the back exit. I didn't want to risk seeing anyone I knew, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was protecting myself, or maybe I was protecting them from having to pretend they cared. Either way, I walked out of Northwestern Memorial Hospital as a completely different person than the one who'd been wheeled in. The transitional housing facility was nothing like the group homes you see in movies. It was actually a converted apartment building in Uptown, with small studio units for people getting back on their feet. My place was on the 3rd floor, barely big enough for a twin bed, a kitchenette, and a desk. But it was mine. The first night I slept there, I cried from relief. Learning to live alone was harder than I'd expected. I'd gone straight from my parents' house to my grandfather's, never really having to figure out basic things like grocery shopping or paying utilities. The first time I tried to make pasta, I burned it so badly the smoke alarm went off. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Chen, came over with a plate of dumplings and a gentle lecture about keeping the heat on medium. The disability payments weren't much, but they covered rent and food. I found some freelance work doing data entry online, which I could manage even on days when my leg was acting up. Sitting at a computer for hours wasn't ideal with my back injuries, but it beat trying to stand for a retail job I wasn't ready for yet. Physical therapy continued 3 times a week at a clinic near the train station. The progress was slow but steady. I graduated from a walker to a cane, then to walking short distances without any help at all. Each milestone felt like a personal victory over everyone who'd written me off. The physical therapist there, Carmen, was different from Kevin at the hospital. She was tougher, more direct, but she understood what it meant to rebuild your life from scratch. The emotional healing was messier. I started seeing Dr. Patterson, a therapist who worked with the housing program. She had this way of asking questions that made me think about things I'd been avoiding, like why I felt guilty about my grandfather's rejection, as if his inability to love me was somehow my fault, or why I was so afraid to trust the few people who were trying to help me. Some days I felt strong and independent, proud of what I was accomplishing. Other days I felt completely lost, questioning every decision I'd made since leaving the hospital. There were nights when I'd lie awake wondering if I should have tried harder to repair things with my grandfather, if maybe I'd misunderstood his words somehow. But then I'd remember the tone of his voice when he called me useless, and I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever love might have existed between us had died long before my accident. I was just finally acknowledging it. I started building a small circle of people who actually seemed to care about my well-being. Carmen introduced me to other patients who'd been through major trauma, and we formed an informal support group that met for coffee every Sunday morning. Mrs. Chen taught me how to cook simple Chinese dishes and invited me to watch her soap operas in Mandarin, even though I couldn't understand a word. Marie, my favorite nurse from the hospital, stayed in touch through text messages. She'd send me pictures of the dogs at the animal shelter where she volunteered, or just check in to see how I was feeling. Having someone remember I existed, someone who had no obligation to care but did anyway, meant more than she probably realized. 3 months after the accident, I finally felt like I was finding my rhythm. I had a routine, a place to live, work that paid the bills, and people who knew my name. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. Then my phone buzzed with a message that threatened to pull me back into a world I'd worked so hard to leave behind. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. Grandpa. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, my heart pounding like I was crossing that street all over again. I was making dinner when the text came through. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast, but it felt like progress from the burned pasta disasters of my first few weeks. The phone was sitting on the counter next to me when it lit up, and seeing Grandpa on the screen made me drop the spatula. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone. 3 months. 3 months of silence after he'd wished I would disappear, and now he was reaching out. For a split second, I let myself hope that maybe he'd had time to think. Maybe he regretted what he'd said. Maybe he'd been worried sick and just hadn't known how to reach out. The message was 4 words long. Why isn't the loan being paid? That was it. No, how are you? No, I heard about the accident. No acknowledgement that I'd nearly died and he'd hung up on the police when they called. Just a demand about money, typed out like I was some kind of bill collector who'd been slacking on the job. I sat down heavily on my small couch, still holding the phone. The loan. I'd completely forgotten about it. Before my parents died, they'd co-signed on my grandfather's mortgage when he refinanced the Lincoln Park house. After they passed, somehow the responsibility had fallen to me, though I'd never fully understood the legal details. I'd been making the monthly payments from my part-time job at the bookstore, treating it like rent for living in his house. But since the accident, since I'd disappeared from his life just like he'd wanted, those payments had obviously stopped. My disability checks barely covered my own expenses. Even if I'd wanted to keep paying, which I definitely didn't, I couldn't afford it. The more I stared at that message, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but something colder and more focused. He'd thrown me away when I was lying broken in a hospital bed, and now he wanted to know why his bills weren't being paid. He hadn't even bothered to ask if I was alive, just jumped straight to what I owed him. I thought about all those nights I'd spent wondering if I'd been too harsh, if maybe I should have tried to contact him first. I'd even drafted texts a few times apologizing for not calling, asking if we could talk. Thank God I'd never sent them. This message showed exactly what I meant to him, and it wasn't about family or love or concern. It was about money. My phone buzzed again. Another message. The bank called. Payment is 2 months behind. Need to know what's going on. Still no mention of the accident. No question about where I was or how I was doing. Just the loan, like I was nothing more than a financial arrangement that had malfunctioned. I could picture him sitting in his leather chair in the living room, probably annoyed that he had to deal with this inconvenience, never once considering that his useless granddaughter might have had good reason to stop sending checks. Part of me wanted to explain everything. Tell him about the weeks in the hospital, the physical therapy, the struggle to relearn how to walk. Make him understand how much his words had destroyed me, how I'd built myself back up from nothing while he was off on his business trips. But I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd probably just ask when the payments would resume. I set the phone down and went back to making dinner, but the eggs had gone cold and rubbery. I scraped them into the trash and ordered pizza instead, sitting at my little table thinking about what to say. How do you respond to someone who's made it clear that your only value was what you could provide financially? By the time the pizza arrived, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to explain or justify or apologize. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he'd hurt me. I was going to answer his question directly. in a way that reminded him exactly what he'd said about me and exactly what he'd lost when he said it. I must have typed and deleted 20 different responses. The first draft was 3 pages long, detailing every hospital visit, every painful step of recovery, everything he'd missed while wishing I would disappear. But that felt like begging for his attention, and I was done begging for scraps of affection from someone who'd never really cared. The second attempt was shorter but meaner. I listed all the bills he could expect to pay himself now, reminded him that I'd been covering his mortgage since I was 17, called him out for being a selfish old man who'd rather wish his granddaughter dead than deal with his own responsibilities. But that wasn't right either. It gave him too much power, showed that he could still make me angry enough to lash out. I kept coming back to his exact words from that phone call. It'd be good if that useless girl finally disappeared. The police officer had repeated them word for word, probably not realizing how deeply they'd cut. But those words had become my truth in a way he never intended. I had disappeared, just like he wanted. I'd vanished from his life completely, and apparently the only thing he missed was my money. My first instinct was to throw those words back at him. Ask the useless girl. But that felt too obvious. Too much like I was just quoting him back to himself. I tried ask the worthless one instead, but deleted that too. It wasn't about repeating his cruelty or making him feel guilty, because I knew he wouldn't feel guilty. Men like my grandfather didn't waste time on regret. Finally, I settled on something simple. Ask the useless one. It wasn't a perfect comeback. It wasn't clever or devastating or particularly creative, but it answered his question in the most honest way possible. He wanted to know why the loan wasn't being paid. He should ask the person he'd written off, the one he'd dismissed as useless and wished would disappear. That person was gone now, along with the monthly payments she'd been making. I typed it out, stared at it for a full minute, then hit send before I could change my mind again. The response felt anticlimactic somehow. After months of imagining what I'd say if he ever contacted me, after all the anger and hurt and sleepless nights, it came down to 5 words on a phone screen. But there was something satisfying about it too, something final and clean. I wasn't trying to hurt him or teach him a lesson. I was just stating a fact. I turned off my phone immediately after sending it. I didn't want to see if he responded, didn't want to get pulled into a longer conversation that would probably just make me feel worse. Whatever he had to say about my message, I didn't need to hear it. The conversation was over as far as I was concerned. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. I'd been carrying around this imaginary confrontation for months, scripting angry speeches and devastating comebacks that I'd never get to deliver. But when the moment actually came, I didn't need any of that drama. I just needed to remind him of his own words and let them speak for themselves. The next morning, I turned my phone back on, half expecting to see a string of angry messages or missed calls, but there was nothing. Radio silence just like before. Maybe he understood exactly what I meant. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he didn't even remember calling me useless in the first place. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I'd spoken up for myself in the only way that felt authentic. I hadn't begged or explained or tried to make him see my side of things. I'd simply reminded him that actions have consequences, and dismissing someone as useless means losing access to whatever usefulness they might have provided. For the first time since that horrible phone call in the hospital, I felt like I'd gotten the last word. Not because I'd been cruel or clever, but because I'd been honest. He'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for, and if he didn't like the results, that was his problem to solve. He never responded to my message, and honestly, I was relieved. The silence felt like closure in a way that any response would have complicated. I'd said what I needed to say, and now I could truly move on without wondering what he might be thinking, or whether he'd ever reach out again. Spring arrived in Chicago with the kind of warmth that makes you believe in second chances. I'd been in the transitional housing for almost 6 months, and my caseworker, Janet, started talking about more permanent options. My walking had improved enough that I could handle stairs without wincing, and I'd picked up more freelance work. The possibility of getting my own apartment, a real lease with my name on it, felt both exciting and terrifying. I decided to enroll in online college courses, something I'd put off for years because my grandfather had always said it was a waste of money for someone like me. Community college credits in business administration, nothing fancy. but it felt like investing in a future I was finally allowed to want. The first class was accounting, which seemed fitting given everything that had happened with the loan situation. The support group that had started over coffee expanded into something more formal. Carmen helped us set up meetings at the community center, and we started getting referrals from other therapists and social workers. There's something powerful about talking to people who understand what it's like to rebuild your life from scratch, whether it's from an accident, an illness, or just toxic family situations. I met David at one of those meetings. He'd lost his leg in Afghanistan and was dealing with his own family drama with parents who couldn't understand why he wasn't grateful to be alive. We started getting coffee after the group sessions, then dinner, then long walks around the lake when the weather was nice. It wasn't romance exactly, more like finding someone who spoke the same language of survival and stubborn hope. Mrs. Chen became like a grandmother to me, the kind I'd never really had. She taught me how to budget for groceries, how to negotiate with landlords, and how to make soup that would last for days. When I finally moved into my own place, a small one-bedroom in Rogers Park, she helped me pick out furniture at thrift stores and garage sales. The new apartment was nothing special, but it was mine in a way that felt revolutionary. I had a lease, utilities in my name, neighbors who said hello in the hallway. I hung pictures on the walls and bought plants that I somehow managed to keep alive. Every mundane detail of independent living felt like a victory over the voice in my head that still sometimes whispered that I was useless. Physical therapy became maintenance rather than recovery. I still had bad days when my back seized up or my leg ached before storms, but mostly I felt strong and capable. I started volunteering at the hospital where I'd spent those awful weeks after the accident, reading to patients who didn't have visitors. It was my way of giving back to the place that had saved my life, even when it felt like my life wasn't worth saving. 1 year after the accident, I got a letter from a law firm representing my grandfather's estate. Apparently, he'd passed away from a heart attack, alone in the Lincoln Park house that he could never afford on his own. The lawyer was reaching out because I was mentioned in his will, though not in the way I might have expected. The letter explained that he'd left me his debts, the mortgage I'd been paying, the credit cards he'd maxed out, medical bills from his final hospital stay. Even in death, he saw me as nothing more than financial responsibility, someone to clean up the mess he'd made. The lawyer seemed confused about why anyone would bequeath debts instead of assets, but I understood perfectly. I wrote back declining to accept any part of his estate, debts included. You can do that apparently, though it means you also can't claim any assets. Fine by me. I didn't want his house or his furniture or whatever money he might have had left. I definitely didn't want his bills. Let the bank and the credit card companies figure it out. That night I called David and told him about the letter. We talked for hours about family and forgiveness and what it means to truly let go of people who hurt you. I realized I felt nothing about my grandfather's death, no sadness or anger or relief. He'd become irrelevant to my life long before he actually left it. 2 years later, I graduated with my associate degree and got promoted to a full-time position managing accounts for a small nonprofit. I moved to a nicer apartment, adopted a cat from the shelter where Marie volunteered, and started planning for a bachelor's degree. The girl my grandfather had called useless had built a life he never could have imagined, one where her worth wasn't measured by what she could provide to people who didn't deserve it.